The world doesn't always test your kindness when people are watching. Sometimes it waits until no one would ever know. I learned that on the coldest Tuesday morning of my life. The wind sliced through downtown Chicago with the kind of bitter edge that made everyone lower their heads and hurry past one another. I tightened the faded wool scarf around my neck and checked my wallet one more time before walking into the neighborhood bakery. $23.41. That was everything I had until Friday, and rent was due in 4 days. I bought 1 cup of black coffee and a warm turkey sandwich, telling myself it would have to last until dinner. Working part-time while finishing nursing school meant every dollar already had a purpose before it ever reached my hands. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the smell of fresh bread disappeared beneath the freezing air. People rushed by carrying expensive coats, designer bags, and places to be. Nobody looked down. Nobody noticed the elderly couple sitting beside the old brick building across the street. Their clothes were worn thin. Their shoes looked too small for the winter. The woman gently rubbed her husband's hands between hers, trying to warm them with nothing but her own body heat. Several people walked around them without slowing down. One businessman accidentally kicked over the paper cup sitting beside them and never even turned around. Something tightened inside my chest. I crossed the street before I could convince myself not to. "Excuse me," I said softly, kneeling beside them. "Would you mind sharing breakfast with me?" The elderly woman blinked in surprise while the man offered a polite smile that somehow carried more dignity than many wealthy people I'd met. "Young lady," he said quietly, "you already paid for that." I smiled back. "Then I guess breakfast tastes better when it's shared." I split the sandwich into 3 uneven pieces, making sure theirs were larger than mine before pretending not to notice. The woman hesitated. "You're keeping the smallest piece." I laughed. I've always liked small sandwiches. It was a terrible lie, but she accepted it anyway. We sat together in silence. While traffic rolled past, the city too busy to notice 3 strangers eating breakfast on a freezing sidewalk. The man thanked me more than once. The woman kept asking if I was sure. I told them I was. Before leaving, I quietly tucked the last $8 from my wallet beneath the folded napkin beside them. I hoped they wouldn't notice until I was gone. "May God bless you," the woman whispered as I stood. I simply waved and walked toward the bus stop, pretending I didn't hear her because gratitude always embarrassed me. I never looked back. If I had, I might have noticed a black Rolls-Royce waiting quietly half a block away. I might have seen 2 men in tailored suits watching from inside. I might have realized that the elderly couple wasn't alone. But I saw none of it. I only knew I was about to be late for class, carrying an empty wallet, half a sandwich in my stomach, and absolutely no idea that my life had just changed forever. I spent the entire bus ride staring at the empty space where $8 had been sitting less than 15 minutes earlier. Most people would probably call it irresponsible. Maybe they would be right. $8 could have covered 2 days of lunches or half a tank of gas for the old car I barely kept running. Instead, it was tucked beneath a paper napkin beside 2 strangers whose names I did not even know. Somehow, I did not regret it. My nursing lecture passed in a blur of anatomy diagrams and patient care procedures, but my mind kept drifting back to the elderly couple. The woman's grateful smile, the quiet pride in the old man's voice. There had been something unusual about them that I could not explain. They never begged. They never reached for anyone walking by. They simply sat together, as though waiting for something far more important than money. When class finally ended just after noon, I hurried toward my shift at the neighborhood bakery. The afternoon crowd was already lined up outside, escaping another blast of icy wind. Mrs. Henderson, my manager, greeted me with her usual warm smile. "Emily, thank goodness you are here. We are short 2 people today." I slipped on my apron without complaining. The next 5 hours disappeared behind coffee orders, fresh pastries, and smiling at customers who barely looked up from their phones. Around 4 o'clock, the front door opened again, and the little bell above it chimed softly. I looked up automatically. It was them. The elderly couple stepped inside together. Their clothes were still worn. Their hands still looked weathered from years of hard living. The old woman smiled when she recognized me. "Hello again," she said gently. "May we come in just to warm up for a few minutes?" "Of course," I answered immediately. "You do not have to buy anything." Mrs. Henderson glanced toward them from behind the register, then looked at me. I expected her to object. Instead, she simply nodded once before returning to the espresso machine. I poured 2 cups of hot chocolate without charging them and carried the drinks to a quiet table near the window. You really should not spend your money on us, the old man said. It is only hot chocolate, I replied. Besides, nobody should have cold hands in this weather. The woman wrapped both hands around the warm cup before looking at me with curious eyes. Tell me something, Emily. If you suddenly became wealthy tomorrow, what would you buy first? I laughed quietly because it felt like such an impossible question. Honestly, she nodded. I would pay off my student loans. Then I would fix the roof over my mother's old house before winter caused any more damage. After that, maybe I would finally sleep through an entire night without worrying about bills. They exchanged a quick glance that lasted less than a second, but I caught it anyway. It was the kind of look people shared when they already knew an answer before asking the question. Outside the bakery window, a familiar black Rolls-Royce remained parked across the street with its engine quietly idling, while 2 men in dark overcoats watched without drawing attention to themselves. I never noticed them. I was too busy believing I was simply sharing another ordinary afternoon with 2 lonely strangers. I finished my shift just after 7 that evening with the familiar ache in my feet that had become part of my daily routine. The bakery. Lights faded behind me as I pulled my coat tighter and started the mile walk back to my apartment. I could have taken the bus, but saving $2.25 mattered more than escaping the cold. Every block I walked felt like another small payment toward the future I kept believing would eventually arrive. My apartment building greeted me with flickering hallway lights and the faint smell of old paint. The upstairs radiator rattled like it had every winter since I moved in. Inside, the tiny studio felt even colder than the street. I dropped my backpack beside the secondhand sofa, opened the refrigerator, and found exactly what I expected. Half a carton of milk, 2 eggs, and leftover vegetable soup. I smiled anyway. Tomorrow was payday. I could make one more night work. Before sitting down to study, I checked my voicemail. The roofing company had called again about my mother's house. The temporary patch they installed after the last storm would not survive another heavy snowfall. Repairs would cost more than $3,000. I thanked them, promised I would call back, and quietly deleted the message before I could hear it a second time. Worrying twice never solved anything. The next morning began before sunrise. My clinical rotation started at 6:30, and I barely had enough time to grab a piece of toast before rushing toward the train station. As I climbed the subway stairs, I noticed a young mother struggling with a stroller while carrying 2 grocery bags. Without thinking, I hurried over and lifted the stroller one step at a time until we reached the sidewalk. "Thank you," she said with tired eyes. "You are going to be late because of me." I smiled. "I would rather be 1 minute late than leave you carrying all of that alone." She laughed softly before disappearing into the morning crowd. By lunchtime, another small moment found me. An elderly veteran stood in line behind me at a food truck, quietly counting loose coins that still came up short. Before he could apologize to the cashier, I added the difference without saying a word. The man tried to hand me a folded $5 bill from his pocket afterward, but I shook my head. "Maybe buy someone else lunch someday," I said instead. His smile stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. What I never realized was that none of these moments were accidents anymore. Across the street, inside parked vehicles, through restaurant windows, and even from the far end of crowded sidewalks, careful eyes continued watching every choice I made. They never stepped in. They never introduced themselves. They simply observed. Late that evening, the elderly couple sat together inside the same black Rolls-Royce that had quietly followed the edges of my ordinary life for 2 days. The expensive leather seats replaced the worn blankets they had carried before. The chauffeur closed the door gently behind them. Vincent Moretti looked out the tinted window as my apartment building disappeared in the distance. Margaret rested her hand over his. Neither of them spoke for several long moments. Finally, Vincent broke the silence with a quiet voice filled with certainty. "She gives when she believes no one will ever repay her." Margaret smiled softly. "Those are the people the world almost never notices." Vincent nodded once. "Then perhaps it is time someone finally did." The following Saturday arrived wrapped in gray skies and the quiet promise of more snow. My clinical rotation had been canceled because of a scheduling conflict, leaving me with something I rarely had anymore: a free morning. I decided to spend it checking on my mother's old house on the south side before another winter storm rolled in. The small white cottage looked exactly as I remembered from childhood except for the roof, where a blue tarp flapped against the cold wind like a flag refusing to surrender. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, and every room still carried traces of the life my mother had built there before illness took her away. I ran my fingers across the old dining table and quietly promised her that somehow I would save the house. I just did not know how yet. After sweeping the porch and making sure no new water had leaked through the ceiling, I stopped by the local hardware store for a roll of weatherproof tape. The cashier noticed me comparing prices before finally choosing the cheapest option. "Trying to fix something?" he asked kindly. "Just trying to keep the snow outside for one more week," I answered with a smile. He quietly scanned a higher quality roll instead, but charged me for the cheaper one. I thanked him, believing it was simply another act of everyday kindness. On my way back toward the train station, I noticed an elderly man standing beside a pickup truck with the hood raised. Thick white smoke drifted into the freezing air while passing drivers barely slowed down. I recognized him immediately. It was Vincent, still wearing the same worn coat he had used during the past few days. "Car trouble again?" I asked as I walked over. He looked up with a sheepish smile. "I think this old truck finally decided it has worked long enough." I laughed softly. Machines have bad days too. I handed him my pair of insulated work gloves before looking under the hood. I knew almost nothing about engines, but I remembered enough from watching my uncle years ago to notice that one battery cable had come loose. After tightening it as best I could with a borrowed wrench from the truck bed, I asked him to try again. The engine started with a rough growl before settling into a steady idle. Vincent looked genuinely impressed. "You seem to know a little about everything." I shrugged. "Not really. I just know enough to keep going when I have to." Before leaving, I slipped the gloves back into his hands. "Keep these. They look warmer on you than they ever did on me." He opened his mouth to refuse, but I had already started walking away toward the station. From across the street, hidden behind the tinted windows of another waiting vehicle, Margaret watched the entire exchange without saying a word. A gentle smile spread across her face before she turned toward her husband, who had quietly entered the luxury sedan through the opposite door only moments later after another driver collected the truck. Vincent removed the worn knit cap from his head, revealing neatly combed silver hair once again. Margaret reached across the seat and squeezed his hand. "She never asks who deserves her kindness," she whispered. Vincent stared through the rear window as my train disappeared into the distance. "No," he answered thoughtfully. "She simply decides that everyone does." I thought the weekend would end like every other one, with homework spread across my tiny kitchen table and another long week already waiting for me. Instead, somewhere across the city, events I could not possibly imagine were already unfolding. The black Rolls-Royce rolled through iron gates that opened before it without a single word from the driver. Beyond them stood the Moretti estate, a sprawling limestone mansion surrounded by acres of snow-covered gardens and towering oak trees. Every light inside glowed with quiet elegance, but the atmosphere carried none of the celebration most people expected from extraordinary wealth. Vincent and Margaret stepped through the front entrance wearing tailored coats once again, their worn clothing and old truck already gone as though they had never existed. House staff greeted them respectfully, yet neither paused for conversation. They walked directly toward a private study lined with dark walnut shelves and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the frozen lake behind the estate. A young assistant stood as they entered. "Sir, your son has just arrived." Vincent nodded once. "Send him in." Less than a minute later, Ethan Moretti stepped through the doorway. He was taller than I had imagined anyone could be, dressed in a charcoal suit without a single wrinkle despite the winter weather outside. Confidence followed him naturally, but there was nothing loud about it. His calm expression carried the quiet discipline of someone who solved problems before anyone else even noticed them. He kissed his mother on the cheek before looking toward his father. "You wanted to see me?" Vincent motioned toward the chair across the desk. "Sit." Ethan did, studying both of them carefully. "Something happened." Margaret smiled faintly. "It did." Vincent slid a plain manila folder across the polished desk. "There is a young woman named Emily Carter." Ethan glanced down without opening it. "Who is she?" "Someone worth knowing." Ethan finally opened the folder. Inside were only a few pages. A nursing student. Part-time bakery employee. No criminal record. Excellent academic performance. Volunteer hours at a community health clinic. No wealthy relatives. No political connections. Nothing that immediately explained why his parents seemed so interested. Ethan looked back up. Why her? Vincent folded his hands. Because she does the right thing when nobody is watching. Ethan remained silent. Years of experience had taught him that his father rarely spoke in riddles unless he wanted someone to reach the conclusion alone. Margaret leaned forward. For 4 days we watched her believe we were ordinary people with nothing to offer her. And? Ethan asked. She never treated us differently, Margaret answered softly. Not once. Ethan closed the folder. You want me to help her? Vincent shook his head. No. I want you to understand her. There is a difference. Ethan looked unconvinced. Good people exist everywhere. Vincent's expression remained steady. Do they continue giving after they have almost nothing left themselves? The room fell quiet. Ethan lowered his eyes to the folder once more before speaking. What exactly do you expect me to do? Vincent answered with only 4 words. Find the truth yourself. Less than an hour later, a dark sedan quietly parked across the street from my apartment building. I was completely unaware of it as I sat beside my window reviewing patient care notes with a bowl of instant soup balanced on my lap. Across the street, Ethan Moretti watched the lights in my apartment switch on for the first time, still believing there had to be another reason his parents had chosen me. He had not yet realized that the greatest mystery was not who I was. It was why someone with so little had never stopped giving. I never noticed the dark sedan that seemed to appear wherever my day began. To me, Monday was simply another race against the clock. My alarm rang at 5 o'clock, and by 6 I was already helping patients through their morning exercises at the rehabilitation clinic before rushing across town for afternoon classes. Every hour had a purpose. Every dollar had a destination. There was little room left in my life for anything else. Across the parking lot, Ethan watched from inside his car with growing confusion. He had expected to uncover hidden motives, secret meetings, or at least some sign that I wanted something from the people I helped. Instead, he saw an ordinary young woman carrying too much responsibility without complaining about any of it. Around noon, I stopped at the grocery store with a handwritten list folded inside my coat pocket. Milk, bread, oatmeal, eggs if they were on sale. I checked every price twice before placing anything into my basket. At the checkout line, the elderly woman ahead of me searched her purse with trembling hands. She quietly apologized after realizing she did not have enough money for her prescription medication and groceries together. The cashier gently suggested putting the medicine aside until her next paycheck arrived. Without thinking, I stepped forward and placed my debit card on the counter. Please include hers with mine, I said. The woman immediately protested. No, sweetheart. I cannot let you do that. I smiled. Then promise me you will get well enough to argue with another stranger someday. Tears filled her eyes as she reached for my hand. I accepted the receipt without checking the remaining balance in my account because I already knew it would be painfully small. Outside the store, I sat inside my aging car and quietly laughed at myself after discovering I now had exactly $14 until payday. Somehow, that number felt less frightening than knowing someone might have gone without medicine. Ethan had watched the entire exchange from the cafe across the street. He had been close enough to hear every word, but far enough away to remain unnoticed. For the first time in years, something unsettled him. He had grown up surrounded by people who expected favors before offering kindness, people who calculated every conversation like a business negotiation. Emily Carter had just spent money she clearly could not spare on someone she would probably never meet again. There had been no cameras, no audience, no opportunity for recognition. Later that afternoon, I arrived at the community health clinic where I volunteered every Monday evening. The waiting room was overflowing, and one of the nurses apologized because several appointments would have to be delayed. Rather than leaving after my assigned hours, I stayed nearly 3 extra hours helping organize patient files, comforting anxious children, and cleaning treatment rooms after everyone else had gone home. Nobody asked me to stay. Nobody offered overtime because volunteers did not receive any. I simply could not leave while work still needed to be done. As I finally walked into the cold night air carrying my worn backpack, Ethan remained seated inside his car across the street. He looked down at the folder his father had given him only 2 days earlier before quietly closing it. The papers inside no longer mattered. Everything important about Emily Carter could not be written on a page. It had to be witnessed. And for the first time, he understood why his parents had not asked him to investigate me. They had asked him to see me. I believe the hardest part of my week was finally behind me. My volunteer shift had ended, my clinical evaluations had gone well, and Friday promised another paycheck that would keep the lights on for one more month. Life had taught me not to expect miracles. Small victories were enough. Friday evening arrived with freezing rain that turned the sidewalks into mirrors of reflected city lights. The bakery overflowed with customers picking up fresh bread before the weekend storm. Mrs. Henderson asked me to cover an extra hour because one employee had called in sick. I agreed without hesitation. Every additional hour mattered. Around 6 o'clock, a young couple entered carrying a little girl wrapped in a bright yellow winter coat. While her parents waited in line, the child wandered toward the display of decorated cookies, her eyes growing wide with excitement. She pressed both hands against the glass and whispered something I could not hear. Her mother gently explained that they could not afford the decorated ones today. The little girl nodded bravely, pretending it did not matter. I quietly placed one snowflake cookie into a small paper bag and walked over. This one accidentally came out with the wrong icing pattern, I said with a smile. Would you help us by taking it home? The little girl looked toward her parents before accepting it with both hands, as though I had given her something priceless. Her smile warmed the room far better than the bakery ovens ever could. Across the street, Ethan watched everything unfold from inside his parked sedan. He no longer needed binoculars, reports, or background checks. Every ordinary moment revealed the same extraordinary pattern. Emily Carter never searched for recognition. She simply noticed people everyone else overlooked. Later that evening, just before closing, a loud voice interrupted the peaceful rhythm of the bakery. A sharply dressed customer placed a birthday cake on the counter with obvious frustration. This inscription is wrong, he said. I ordered blue lettering, not silver. Mrs. Henderson apologized immediately and explained that the bakery would gladly correct the decoration at no additional charge. The man continued speaking loudly enough that every customer turned to watch. Seeing Mrs. Henderson's hands beginning to shake, I stepped beside her. Sir, I said calmly, we can have it fixed in less than 15 minutes if you would like to wait. We want your celebration to be perfect. My voice remained steady, and after a long pause, the man's expression softened. Fine, he sighed. I suppose mistakes happen. He sat down without another complaint. Mrs. Henderson looked at me with quiet relief. Thank you, she whispered. You saved my evening. I simply smiled and picked up the cake for the decorator. None of it felt unusual to me. Helping people had become as natural as breathing. 20 minutes after closing, I finally locked the front door and stepped into the icy night. The parking lot was almost empty except for a line of sleek black vehicles pulling silently toward the curb. Their polished headlights reflected across the wet pavement like rows of stars. Curious, I paused for only a second before assuming some important customer had arrived nearby. I adjusted my backpack and continued walking without another glance. Inside the lead vehicle, Vincent and Margaret watched me disappear down the sidewalk. Ethan sat beside them in complete silence. After several long moments, Vincent looked at his son. Now you understand. Ethan never took his eyes off the young woman walking alone through the cold. His answer came almost as a whisper. She has been changing lives every single day without realizing anyone was watching. I assumed the line of black vehicles had nothing to do with me, so I continued walking through the freezing drizzle toward the bus stop with my head lowered against the wind. My paycheck rested safely inside my backpack, and I was already calculating which bills had to be paid first. The roof repairs could wait another week. The student loan payment could not. As the traffic light changed, I heard someone call my name. Emily. The voice was calm, familiar, and impossible to place. I turned slowly. Standing only a few feet away were the elderly couple I had met outside the bakery days earlier. They were smiling exactly as I remembered, but everything else had changed. The worn coats were gone. In their place were elegant wool overcoats tailored with quiet precision. The faded gloves had become fine leather. Their posture carried effortless confidence instead of quiet hardship. Behind them stood several professionally dressed men who maintained a respectful distance without speaking. For a long moment, I simply stared, convinced I had mistaken them for someone else. I almost did not recognize you, I admitted. Margaret laughed softly. That is understandable. Vincent stepped forward with the same gentle expression he had worn while pretending to struggle with an old truck only days before. Emily, thank you for stopping. I looked from them to the line of waiting luxury vehicles and back again. What is all of this? Before either of them answered, another car door opened. A tall man in a charcoal overcoat stepped onto the sidewalk. I recognized him immediately, although I had never actually met him. He was the man I had occasionally noticed from a distance during the past week without ever giving him a second thought. Ethan walked toward us with measured steps before stopping beside Vincent. There was nothing intimidating about his expression. If anything, he looked unexpectedly thoughtful. Vincent placed one hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. "This is our son." Ethan offered a polite nod. "It is nice to finally meet you, Emily." My mind struggled to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Finally, I repeated quietly. Margaret smiled with the warmth of someone speaking to family. "We owe you an apology." "An apology?" "We were never truly homeless," Vincent explained. "We chose to spend several days living as ordinary people because we wanted to remember how strangers treat those who appear to have nothing." I felt the cold air leave my lungs. Every conversation, every cup of hot chocolate, every shared breakfast, every moment replayed itself inside my head. You were testing people?" Margaret nodded gently. "Not only people. We were searching for character." I looked down at the wet sidewalk, suddenly embarrassed by every simple act I had considered too small to matter. I did not do anything special. Ethan spoke for the first time since arriving. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet certainty. "That is exactly why my parents never forgot you." Vincent reached into his coat pocket and removed the pair of insulated work gloves I had insisted he keep beside the broken truck. He held them carefully as though they were something valuable. "You gave these away believing we would never meet again," he said. "You shared your breakfast when you barely had enough for yourself. You paid for medicine that was not yours. You offered kindness where most people offered only convenience." I could not find the right words. I simply stood there while snowflakes drifted between us. For the first time in my life, I realized that the smallest choices I had ever made had quietly reached people whose lives were far larger than my own. I stood speechless as the snow settled softly around us, trying to understand how a few ordinary days had somehow led to this extraordinary moment. Vincent looked at me with the same gentle eyes that had thanked me over a shared sandwich on a freezing sidewalk. Nothing about his kindness had changed. Only the disguise had disappeared. "Emily," he said quietly, "would you allow us to repay your generosity?" I shook my head almost immediately. "There is nothing to repay. I only treated you the way I hoped someone would treat my family." Margaret smiled with tears gathering in her eyes. "That answer is exactly why we cannot simply walk away." Ethan stepped forward, holding a neatly sealed envelope. "This is not charity," he said before handing it to me. "Please read it before deciding." My fingers hesitated as I opened it. Inside was a letter from a private educational foundation I had never heard of. It stated that my remaining nursing school tuition had been fully funded through graduation. There was also an approved grant covering the emergency repairs on my mother's roof, issued through a community housing preservation program. Every document carried official signatures. Every page looked completely real. I stared at them until the words blurred together. "There has to be some mistake," I whispered. Vincent gently shook his head. "No mistake. We simply asked ourselves what someone like you truly needed. You never asked for luxury. You only needed a fair chance." I felt tears warming my cold cheeks before I even realized I was crying. "I cannot accept something this big." Ethan smiled for what seemed like the very first time. It was quiet, sincere, and completely different from the reserved expression I had seen all week. "You already accepted it the day you shared your breakfast," he said. "You invested in strangers without expecting anything in return. Allow someone else to invest in your future the same way." I looked from one face to another, searching for the right words, but gratitude had left me speechless. Margaret gently wrapped her arms around me in a warm embrace that reminded me of my mother. "Never feel guilty for receiving kindness," she whispered. "Goodness grows only when someone is willing to pass it forward." Weeks passed, and life slowly began changing in ways I had once believed belonged only in movies. My mother's roof was repaired before the next heavy snowfall. I graduated from nursing school without carrying the crushing weight of unpaid tuition. I accepted a full-time position at the rehabilitation clinic where I had once been only a student. Ethan occasionally visited under the excuse of delivering paperwork for the foundation or checking on community projects. although we both eventually admitted those reasons had become unnecessary. Our conversations grew longer, our laughter easier, and our friendship found its own quiet rhythm without either of us forcing it. Looking back now, I still think about that cold morning when I divided one simple sandwich into 3 uneven pieces. At the time, I believed I was giving away half of my breakfast. I never imagined I was opening the door to an entirely different future. Life has taught me many lessons since then, but one remains clearer than all the others. Wealth can build beautiful homes, impressive businesses, and remarkable legacies. But kindness is the only thing that quietly enters another person's life and continues growing long after the moment has passed. Sometimes the greatest opportunities do not arrive dressed in expensive clothes or announced with grand introductions. Sometimes they are sitting quietly on a cold sidewalk, waiting to discover whether compassion still exists in the heart of a stranger.